So I know it's a long gospel, and harder on Deacon than it is on me. But I want to talk about that this year, because usually I skip over that whole part and just jump into the more interesting part of Joseph, you know. But really, I want to just spend just a minute here. We're trying to look at Jesus' ancestral heritage. So we hear in this first reading, maybe one time a year, and I think it comes up again, maybe twice a year, we come to this reading. And it's like a seemingly endless list of names of people that we're not familiar with. And that's what makes it so difficult. We don't really know these names and how they relate to Jesus. But there's a reason why Matthew was inspired by God to document this lineage. So no one else does this. None of the other Gospels they all have their own point to document something, but Matthew is inspired to document this lineage. So I know it's not the tender story of his birth or the beautiful story of the angels in the middle of the night. And see, the nice thing about the Christmas Mass, you know, we have the Vigil Mass, and then we have the Mass at night or midnight, and then we can have a dawn Mass, and then we have a Mass during the day. So in a beautiful way, the Gospels follow the story of Jesus. So we don't get into the beautiful birth story of Jesus until the midnight Mass. That's where we talk about Joseph and Mary traveling. They have no place to stay. And then the Mass at dawn, that's the one where we recount the shepherds in the field in the middle of the night, where all the angels appear to them and draw them to come to adore Jesus in the manger. See, it follows kind of the time frame as the night progresses. So ours is before this happens for Jesus. So we focus on the lineage. So in this, there are 3 sets of 14. And it's the culmination of these 3 sets of 14 that it's like 3 times David. 3 is always like a sign of excellence. So they're trying to, they're pointing back to King David here, that Jesus is beyond even King David. And so in the first set, we hear Abraham to David. Now we know Abraham, he's the father of faith. So we always go back, even in the Eucharistic prayer, we mention Abraham as being the very first one that recognized the one true God, right? The very first one. And God says, from you, your lineage will be as many as the stars in the sky. That's how many children will come after you. You are the very first person of faith. And so that very first block of 14, from Abraham to David, and we know David, King David, right? He is the amazing king of which God promises through him, his lineage, that the Messiah would come. So that very first group of 14, Abraham to David, it shows that Jesus' ancestry is from Judah. Now, Judah is compared by Jacob to be a reclining lion, the king of beasts. And so we know that in the New Testament, especially the book of Revelation, it says that Jesus will be the fulfillment of the prophecy of Jacob, that Jesus is the lion of the tribe of Judah. So the kingdom that Jesus will establish will be everlasting. And that's the promise to that first group. Now the second generation goes from King David to Jeconiah. And it covers this very sad, difficult period in Jewish history. And all these royal sons of David, all his sons, his grandsons, his great-grandsons, they all become wicked. And they mislead the people over and over. So all this lineage that comes after King David, over and over, they're really sinful. They want power, they want the world, they'll worship false gods, they'll do anything to gain. And so this whole heritage that follows David is all these wicked kings. And it shows the imperfect nature of humanity and how God works through our imperfections. to bring about the good. So it is proof that even when we mess up, even in our weakness, even in our failing, we can't dismantle God's plan. And God often uses even the weak and failing to make his plan happen. So it gives us a sense of confidence that even if we have bad leaders, even if things go awry around us, no matter what's happening around us, we can't think, oh, God's lost his ability to control things. It's like we see it through our history of our Jewish heritage. Over and over, they've had bad leadership that really messed up the people. But God was with them, and he brought them out of that. So of the 14 names, only 3 of them were good kings. King David, King Hezekiah, and Josiah. Those 3 kings were the only 3 out of the whole history of kings that were true to God. So the stories of the royal sons of David are contained in the first and second book of Kings. So despite the infidelity of David's sons and his grandsons and his great-grandsons, the Lord remains faithful to his covenant oath that David's kingdom would last forever. So it's proof. No matter what's happening in the world, God's oath goes through. It's not going to be changed. So when the kingdom of Judah was defeated, Jerusalem is completely destroyed at this point. They tear down the temple, they get rid of everything, and they move the people into Babylonian captivity. The people think we've lost everything. We've lost our heritage, we've lost our city, we've lost our temple, and now we're in slavery in Babylonian. And so the people are thinking, oh, it's all over with. But God's oath will be fulfilled. And so Matthew's genealogy shows on how God is eternally faithful to his promise. So now the last set of 14. And the last set of 14 goes from the Babylonian exile to Jesus. So now we see the kind of returning back. And so the last name that we read in Jesus' genealogy is Jeconiah, recorded in the Old Testament, was Zerubbabel. And so he was the grandson of King Jeconiah, and he led the people back to Judah. So eventually from their Babylonian exile, they're brought back to Jerusalem, and they begin to rebuild the temple, and they begin to establish themselves in this area. But life was not always peaceful. So during the 2nd century before Jesus' birth, there was a persecution again of the Jewish people. So even though they brought themselves back into this, they're rebuilding the temple, they're making it even more beautiful than what it was before, they're gathering all the people back into this, there's no more problems for the Jewish people. So some of the royal descendants flee the area because of the persecution. And where do they go? So what they do is, this is the important part what you'll see with the story. So they fled Jerusalem because of the persecution, and they go 90 miles north, and they find this little empty area, and they settle themselves there, and that's called Nazareth. That's Mary's hometown. And you see, because of the persecution, they took records with them. And they want to reestablish themselves far from the persecution. And they settle that little town of Nazareth. That very solid clan from David is settled up there. So Nazareth means branch. And it's reflected their hope in the prophets who foretold that a branch or shoot of David would come forth from the fallen tree of David's line. And so they had no evidence of this except their trusting in God's promise that from a branch, from a shoot of Jesse, the Messiah would come. And that's exactly what happens. He comes through Mary. And so these descendants of David carried with them these private records of their genealogy. And this is why it's important. Now we're moving back to Jerusalem, and time is passing. And this is where King Herod the Great comes. And he's very evil. And so this king wants to destroy anyone that has a linkage to the Messiah line. And so what he does is, in Jerusalem, he goes into the temple and he destroys all the public genealogies of the Jewish people. He destroys them. So to make sure that no one could challenge his kingship and claim royal descendants from being David, he wants to eliminate any proof that anyone would say, I'm from the line of David, I'm the rightful king. He wants to eliminate that. But because they took those records up north, they have it. They have the lineage. And so that's where it comes to Matthew. So Matthew does this private genealogy of the line of David because those records had survived up in Nazareth. Now Matthew's a tax collector from Capernaum, and he's able to record it. Now, though the list of names can be seen boring and repetitive, I know that, it's a record of how God's faithful and merciful in salvation, despite the infidelities of his children. God is always faithful and ready to welcome us. God's always faithful, and he knows his promises. And so often I preach about this, we can't let fearful things shake us. We cannot let whatever's shaking in the world, whatever's shaking in our lives, our own drama in our families, our own drama in our own lives, we cannot believe for 1 second that God is not faithful to us. The history shows it, that no matter what humans try to do, no matter how people try to change history, the Lord knows what they're going to do, and he's already planned something ahead of time to prepare for it. See, we celebrate this amazing, amazing feast day where our Lord becomes flesh for us. He became flesh so that he could turn bread into his flesh and we can receive him. You see, the Lord knows us, and he knows our personal history, and he knows our weakness, and he knows our failings, but in his heart it's full of mercy and love. When you receive him today in Holy Communion, when you receive him today, recognize who you're receiving. He is the God who is faithful and true to his people, and he loves us, and he is merciful to us.